All right. Good evening. My name is Caitlin Wilson, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism. We hope you are all well and safe, and we thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know that we're recording this panel, and the video will be posted on our YouTube channel afterwards. Following our initial discussion, we will open things up for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function, which is in the bottom toolbar of the Zoom. It is Povich Center policy to reserve the first 2 questions for students, and then we'll open it up to the public. Now I'd like to turn things over to Povich Center Director, Mark Hyman.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks to everyone for joining tonight for a discussion that is important and timely. More timely even than when Kevin Blackistone and I began kicking this idea around about 8 weeks ago. If you enjoy the panel tonight, we hope you'll return for others. Our next event is November 17th, and that will be the annual Povich Symposium. I'll have more to share about that at the end of the program tonight. For now, let me thank my colleagues, Caitlin Wilson and Professor of the Practice, Kevin Blackistone, for their prominent roles tonight. And allow me to introduce Lila Bromberg, one of our most impressive students at Merrill College and the Povich Center. If you look in your chat box, you'll find a link to an excellent piece written on the very topic we're discussing tonight. The author of that excellent piece is Lila. So let me turn things over to Lila, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you, Mark. As he said, I'm Lila, and I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism and the Shirley Povich Center. Our panelists tonight include Maryland football head coach Mike Locksley, who recently launched the National Coalition of Minority Football Coaches, which aims to prepare, promote, and produce minority coaches across all levels of football. And he's also part of the first and only FBS University to include a Black president, athletic director, and head football coach. Then we have Cyrus Mehri, who is a founding partner of law firm Murray and Scallett, and he helped create the NFL's Rooney Rule, and is also a co-founder of Working Ideal and the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which advocates for a hiring and promotion of minority candidates in the league. And then we have Jeremi Duru, who is a law professor at American University, where he teaches about sports law, civil procedure, and employment discrimination. And he also wrote the book, Advancing the Ball, which examines the continued lack of head coaching opportunities for Black coaches in the NFL. So thank you all for joining us to discuss such an important issue. And now I'll hand it off to our moderator, Merrill Professor of the Practice, Kevin Blackistone, who is a national sports columnist for Washington Post and a panelist on ESPN's Around the Horn.
Thank you very much, Lila, and thank you everyone for joining. We have a short period of time to talk about what has been a decades long conversation. So I'm not going to waste too much time with too much of an introduction, but I do just want to give a little bit of context about what it is we're talking about tonight. In college football at this particular time, we have 13 Black head coaches, of which Mike Locksley here at the University of Maryland is one among 130 football bowl schools. And that's down from about 15 Black coaches just a couple of years ago. And in the NFL, for context, we started this season with 3 Black NFL head coaches, which is the same number that we had in 2003 when the league instituted the Rooney Rule as a method to diversify hiring. So let me start this conversation by talking to Coach Locksley here, who just before this football season commenced, started an organization called the National Coalition of Minority Football Coaches, which you heard Lila mention. And so, Mike, I'd like to ask you, why did you start this organization, and how have we gotten to the point in your career that we needed to start this organization?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kevin. And for me, obviously the pandemic and being quarantined at home, having a lot of extra time on our hands, create an opportunity for me to do a full 360. And as I've told people, this is something that I've been loosely doing for the last 20 years. I've been in the business 30 years as a assistant head coach or coordinator. And as I get older in this profession, I become one of the guys that people call upon when they're looking to hire minority coaches for other positions. And because of the network I've created, well, I can think back and I can remember 2 years ago when I was at Alabama as a coordinator. I called Pep Hamilton, a very close friend of mine who we've known each other over 20 years. And we were both a minority of black quarterback coaches and coordinators that were at the major Division I level. And I watched and saw some of our counterparts, the Sean McVays and Matt LaFleur's and the Kyle Shanahan's and this crew that have done a tremendous job and each have ascended into positions of head coach. And I said to Pep, I said, we need to come together and create an opportunity for Black quarterback coaches and coordinators to get together to exchange ideas to help kind of promote the fact that we have some qualified quarterback coaches and coordinators that are capable of doing the job in which we see guys like Shanahan and McVay and those guys. And so, we created what was called the Quarter Black Summit back in 2018. And we met down in Morehouse College. We invited all the coordinators and Division I football and the HBCUs and all the coordinators and quarterback coaches. Doug Williams was involved and helped get us the Morehouse facility. But then we also enlisted the help of Shaq Harris and Jimmy Ray, who both had NFL ties, and they invited an NFL guy to come sit in on the first Quarter Black Summit we put together. And from that, we spent a day there just exchanging ideas, communicating, creating a network of each other to use to help each other promote the fact that we had viable candidates. And from that, the NFL loved the idea, and that bore the Quarterback Summit that they now have done the last 2 years under the NFL umbrella, which I've been happy to be a part of where it's gone. Now, the issue I saw with it was that it still didn't address some of the issues we're facing in college football. This is my second time around being a head coach. And I can remember back in 2008, 2009, when I took over at New Mexico, at one point we had gotten it up to about 18 active Black head football coaches in football. And then you look and see, and I turned 50 on Christmas Day. And as I like to tell people, my give a crap gauge is on E in terms of being politically correct. And I said, you know what? And we're down to 14 is what the number is now. And instead of crying about it and continuing to talk about it, what can I do to help maybe fix it and be a part of a solution? And I enlisted the help of some very powerful people that have helped me get back to the job I've always coveted, which is leading the University of Maryland football program. And if you look at the board of directors of the people that we've enlisted to help us, and as we say, our mission to prepare, promote, and produce the next level of coaches at all levels and not just the NFL, to create this coalition to champion, and again, things that I feel are important because there's just not enough of us and there are enough viable candidates. So we wanted to bring light on the fact that there are viable candidates that all they're looking for is an opportunity. And that's what the coalition wants to do, is help champion and create opportunities to show we have guys that can do the job and lead programs.
Let me turn to Cyrus. Cyrus, a number of years ago, you, along with Johnny Cochran, did a study on the hiring of coaches of color in the NFL, which created a framework in the NFL to try and diversify the ranks. Yet here we are today, Mike Locksley talking about this problem in college coaching, and a lot of chirping going on around the NFL right now about the fact that we started this season with just 3 Black coaches. How did we get back to this situation, and what's different now, if anything, than from when you and Johnny Cochran did that study?
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks everyone organizing this. And Coach, it's a pleasure to share the forum with you, and I appreciate your leadership on this. Well, Johnny Cochran and I kind of created a catalyst moment with the black coaches in the NFL report superior performance, inferior opportunities, which had statistical evidence as well as qualitative evidence that it wasn't a level playing field. And that created a moment of change, and a lot of positive change followed. A few years ago, we had as many as 8 minority head coaches, and depending on the titles, 8 general managers or near general manager positions out of the 32 clubs. So we were really making progress. But like any movement, you have moments of up and down, and we got pushed backwards in a big way the last few years. And the numbers plummeted, and there were egregious things that happened, like the Oakland Raiders didn't really have an open process, and we challenged the league to try to do something about it, and they fell short. We, and I'm saying me as a Fritz Pollard Alliance, and then we saw incredibly talented candidates get overlooked the last couple of years. So it's created kind of a moment of crisis. We really felt it very powerfully. This is Rod Graves, Harry Carson. Rod Graves now heads up the Fritz Pollard Alliance, and Harry Carson has been involved for years, former Hall of Famer, and I went, as we normally do, in Mobile to meet with current coaches and front office minority executives, and people were just deeply, profoundly upset about the last few years. So luckily, and so you ask why, how did we go backwards? I'll tell you why I think strategically how to analyze this. One, any movement like this, you have to have a strong pipeline, and we deserve. It's worth taking a moment to give credit to Bill Walsh and what he did for the years when he was a head coach, creating opportunities. The Rooney Rule, which we champion, is about leveling the playing field, but you really need a cultural change. And the Rooney Rule is very limited. It's one tool in a toolbox, but if you don't create the entire DNA change, then it can only take you so far. So the real question for the moment is, are we at a turning point where we can create a cultural change in the NFL and cultural change in this nation to truly act intentionally to create diversity in our nation? And I think that's kind of where we are. And personally, I'm very hopeful about where we are, at least with the league, but also I think national awareness in so many other ways, that we could actually finally be at this turning point moment. So I think what happened is that the rule can only do so much. It impacts getting people in the door to compete, but it doesn't change the decision makers, and maybe they're what social scientists will call in-group favoritism and other things that create barriers.
Thank you. Jeremi, you looked at this from the inside, you look at this from the outside, you literally wrote the book on how all of this has transpired. What is your opinion of how we've gotten to where we are, and how much of a problem is this today?
I think it's a problem today, and a substantial one. I think the way we got to where we are now, Cyrus referenced it, what happened out in Oakland. Let me just elaborate a bit on it. So at the end of 2017 season, there were, as Cyrus mentioned, 8 head coaches of color. John Gruden got the job out there in Oakland. And let me describe briefly the process through which he got the job. So the Rooney Rule has been for, you've covered it, Kevin, has been for years. People have talked about the pros and the cons. It's not a perfect rule. As Cyrus just mentioned, all it does is get you in the door. And so there are some questions as to whether it was really doing the job. And the Oakland Raiders had an opening. The owner of the club met with John Gruden for Christmas Eve dinner. They basically decided that they were quote unquote all in for Gruden to get the job as the next head coach of the Raiders. He coached there before, and he'd been resisting the owner's entreaties for years to come back and coach the team. After that meeting, the club interviewed 2 candidates of color, neither of whom were identified by people in the league, the Fritz Pollard Alliance, or others as being ready for the position. They were both interviewed by the general manager rather than by the owner. Whereas Gruden, of course, was interviewed by the owner. And then a couple of weeks later, Gruden was hired. And when Gruden was hired, the owner said, I probably wouldn't have fired Jack Del Rio if I didn't know Gruden was coming in. So it was, the gig was up, right? It was pretty clear that the job was Gruden's to begin with. And let me say, this is not to discredit Gruden. He's a fine coach, I think, by all estimates. But the question is the process. And at that point, I think a lot of folks in the league, people of color, felt like the league broke faith with them, that they'd held tight to the league's argument that, hey, we're trying to do something. And at that moment, it appeared as though the league had abdicated, had abandoned this rule that was supposed to mean so much. And so I think that just gave clubs a sense that, hey, we don't really have to take this thing seriously. And so we couldn't even get beyond the rule to the culture change Cyrus is talking about, because I think many clubs felt like the league isn't that serious about that. Let's not worry about it. And since then, the numbers have just plummeted. It's unfortunate, Kevin. Cyrus mentioned the pipeline. The candidates are there. The candidates are there on the offensive side of the ball, and the defensive side of the ball, more on the defensive than offensive. But there are offensive coaches out there like Bieniemy, like Jim Caldwell, who can step in and take a head coaching job. There are college coaches who are outstanding. One of them is on the panel with us now. There are others. But it just seems like again and again, decision is made to fill the ranks with, as Coach Coxley mentioned, the Sean McVays, the Matt LaFleur's, the Shanahans, the Zach Taylors, and the candidates of color they're overlooked. And there's got to be something more if we're going to get this thing turned around than what exists systemically right now.
And you mentioned, let me just pick up on that issue about opening the door, giving people opportunities, putting people in the pipeline. All of a sudden, we look around the league right now, and if we watched television last night, we saw Cliff Kingsbury, who made the leap from college coach straight to NFL head coach. We know about Matt Rule. He made the same leap. That's not something that we used to see. And so now the question is, for me, have the rules all of a sudden changed, right? And if you have a declining number of black head coaches in college ranks to begin with, and all of a sudden those guys are being plucked, now what do you do?
Yeah, the rules have changed, Kevin. I mean, I think Tony Dungy talks about how when he was coming up, he was told that being a defensive coordinator was the way to go if you wanted to be a head coach. I think Mike Tomlin got the same advice. As of the last few years, it's been offensive coordinator. Now, African Americans have been essentially kept out of the offensive coordinator role for the most part. We've got some who've come through, and that goes back systemically to African Americans being kept out of the quarterback position. And so you have fewer African Americans in that pool of offensive coordinators, but that's starting to build up. And then the goalposts shift again. And now we're at the college coach pipeline, where there is never, unless I'm incorrect, someone on this panel can correct me, I don't think there's ever been a college head coach who's gone directly to the NFL. We've seen it, who's African American. We've seen it for white coaches, but not African American. So one, the goalposts are shifting. But two, wherever the goalposts are, Kevin, it seems like African Americans are subordinated in the pecking order.
Can I just elaborate on the intersection
Sure.
of college and the pros a little bit, Kevin?
Yeah.
We've had amazing minority candidates of color on the college side. We have one on this call now, but I mean, going back to Ty Willingham, there's been year after year, Kevin Sumlin, the guys who were like so dominant on the college level, not getting an opportunity to be really seriously considered on the pro level. But another piece that gets missed, if you are a white pro football head coach, you are guaranteed a head coach job on the college level. You have that golden parachute. Until Herm Edwards, a couple of years ago, hired by Arizona State with an African-American athletic director, Ray Anderson, that we never had any former black head coach go become a head coach in college. Never. And so the interplay of these two levels has never been a healthy pool, either up, down, sideways, however you want to look at it. It just hasn't been there. And that's why actually I think, Coach, your organization could really help on that intersection.
And so, Mike, on that point, let me ask you, because it seems like a lot of this is asking for goodwill on the part of NFL owners, team presidents, athletic directors, and friends within the college football coaching community. And we still have this problem. So is it not time for what we've seen happen in this country in the last 6-7 months after the tragic killing of George Floyd, that we have to bring some other sort of pressure to bear upon college institutions and NFL franchises in order to open up opportunities for guys like you?
Yeah, Kevin, as I said before, with this organization, with the coalition that we started, we're not into trying to bully people into to giving us opportunities. We're into doing our part as part of the solution to make sure, one, that we prepare the guys that want to aspire to be these head coaches. But then, as we've all said on this panel already, there's a lot of qualified guys that have the tools right now. And the biggest issue we face is not being able to get in the room, not being able, as you said, the goodwill isn't always there. And so what I've tried to do is, if you look at the people that I've enlisted to help me with the coalition, people answer Nick Saban's calls. They answer Bill Polian's calls. I've got Debbie Yowell on here. So I've got a mixture of not just Black leaders in this business like a Mike Tomlin or a Chris Greer, but a combination of really powerful, successful leaders at all the different levels. So when we make a phone call, these coaches that we produce, the list and the people we produce and put in front of the leaders and the powers that be, whether they're presidents or GMs or athletic directors, these names will have been vetted by qualified people that know the business and not just where did this name come from. And we talked about the Raiders interviewing people that weren't even on lists. Well, I can tell you, we've been contacted by some of the organizations and some of the places that have openings now as an organization. And as I told them, we're not here to bully you, but we want to make sure and we're going to expose the fact that we have qualified people that our coalition has vetted and that have the tools necessary to go be successful head coaches at the major college level or the NFL level. And some of it's rebranding. I mean, I was a failed head coach at New Mexico. And if it wasn't for the path I took, listening to my mentor, Debbie Yowell, of getting under the umbrella, you talk about the Bill Walsh family tree. Now you look at the Shanahan family tree and what those guys have done. And I'm part of the Nick Saban family tree. And I want to use all of my tentacles and relationships that I have to try to help open the door and get these viable, qualified minority candidates in front of the powers that be. I think it's time for us to make sure that we show that we do have these type of candidates out there.
Well, and let me pick up on that with you, Cyrus, because you and Johnny went to the NFL with a file that of successful, historic discrimination lawsuits against some of the biggest Fortune 500 companies in this country, particularly Coca-Cola. And you had the statistics, you had the data to prove that what the NFL was doing in terms of hiring coaches was systemically damaging to coaches of color, and that it was not a fair process.
Right.
And so I wonder if there's some other sort of pressure, economic pressure, legal pressure that should be applied and can be applied to pro teams as well as to colleges, many of which are state-owned and take in taxpayers' money to make them do the right thing.
Well, I have a few thoughts on that. First of all, Johnny and I were outsiders. We weren't within the industry, right? We were litigators. We had my firm had the tailwind of the Coca-Cola settlement, which got everybody in corporate America's attention. And there were ideas from that settlement that we use in our advocacy. which was, for example, the first use of what became the Rooney Rule I used in the Coca-Cola settlement, for example. But so that created an extra lever. But in terms of today, I think we started to see some activity last year's hiring cycle that could be pivotal going forward to help change the DNA, the cultural change. So George Saleh, defensive coordinator of the 49ers, Richard Sherman spoke out for him. Eric Bieniemy, everybody knows that he should have been hired 2 hiring cycles ago if there was a true fairness in the NFL, right? And Sammy Watkins spoke out for him. So players' voices get heard. And if more player voices can be heard, the actual players on their team vouching for their coordinators to get a fair shot, that will really be pivotal, I think, going forward. I also think even before the George Floyd tragedy happened, I felt a sea change within the league dynamics. Because there are a lot of things Jeremy and I have been advocating for the last 5 years that were not being fully heard. Like, for example, hey, let's follow the social scientists. They show that if you have multiple diverse candidates, that has a monumental impact. I mean, as crazy as these numbers sound, one minority candidate doesn't move the needle. 2 minority candidates on the interview slate, it goes up like 190 times differential.
Hmm.
And for women, it's like a 90 times differential if they're 2 female candidates. And you kind of saw that in the vice president's Biden's search for women of color for the VP. He had a lot of women of color he interviewed, and that changed all the norms. Because you could say, hey, we have a lot of different people who could step in as VP or presidency. So, I mean, that's why you need to have a multiple diverse candidates. This offseason, in February, we met with the league leaders, FPA, Coach Dungy, a lot of prominent people in the league, and we were being heard on that point. We were being heard on each team creating a diversity action plan, which, they're billion-dollar enterprises, but none of them had that in any meaningful way. So there's a lot of things that we were being heard about early this year, but it came mostly because of our voices being heard when our guys were getting together at the Mobile during the Senior Bowl, speaking out, and in other places, our guys speaking out, and the fact that the ownership fell short the last few hiring cycles. So I felt like we were seeing a sea change. Stars were aligning, and Art Rooney, Dan Rooney's son, who basically co-founded obviously the Rooney Rule, he's Mr. Rooney. He is now the chair of the diversity committee for the owners. So I just felt like things were changing, but now we also have the nation changing in a big way. So I do feel like I have a great feeling of hope right now that this third phase, the cultural change phase, we're on the cusp of that.
And part of that cultural change is what you mentioned, advocacy by players for coaches who are representative. And so I just wonder with you, Mike, in recruiting, and given the fact that we've seen a voice from, particularly from Black players at the college level that we've never seen before in the wake of George Floyd. And I know this because I called some of the top 10 recruits, almost all of whom are Black. I think one is not Black, earlier this year, just to see if an institution, a coach, an athletic director who voiced support for Black Lives Matter meant that they would look at that school a lot more closely than they would a school where maybe that movement wasn't being embraced. And so I'm wondering if players, if parents, guardians of those players begin to coalesce around these issues and begin to say, our kid's not going to go play for a school that hasn't had a very good record at trying to give an opportunity to people like Mike Locksley. Do you think that would have an impact on these hiring decisions?
There's no doubt. I think part of the power of even me being able to rebrand myself was the power of the fit and the recruiting part of being able to attract talented players. But what I've seen, Kevin, that's probably driven the needle more than just the players or the recruits that are coming out speaking out. It's the media, and I can tell you, in 2018 as the offensive coordinator at Alabama, broke just about every record in the SEC, scoring, points, you name it. And what you heard most of the time was Tua Tagovailoa. You didn't hear Mike Locksley. And then the very next year, you watch Joe Brady, who, I won the Broyles Award in 2018 and was there to present it when Joe Brady won it at LSU. And again, Joe did a tremendous job, was the co-coordinator there, and they put up record numbers. And then every time you saw LSU on their way to the championship, all you heard was Joe Brady. And to me, I think the media is just as powerful, which is why we put the promote part of what the coalition is all about, is enlisting people like yourselves and people that are in mainstream media to show that there's some really talented guys. I use Pep Hamilton as an example. Pep did a tremendous job developing Andrew Luck at Stanford, went to Indy a lot of because of what he did with Andrew at Stanford, and then got caught up in the politics of Indianapolis. And next thing you know, Pep's not on any list as a potential head coach, and he resurrects himself over there in LA with the Chargers, where he's got that rookie quarterback from Oregon playing really well. And again, you would think Pep Hamilton, who led the XFL Defenders, would be one of these viable candidates because he has head coaching experience. He's had great success. He's been in the quarterback room, but you never hear the story of the black offensive coordinator, the black quarterback coaches, even the ones at the HBCUs being talked about in mainstream media. And that's why I found the needle moves, because when that media gets behind a name, it's as powerful as anything you can do. I do think recruiting and players speaking out helps, but I think the attack needs to become making sure the mainstream media know the names of the guys that are doing bang up jobs for these organizations in college and in the pros, and doing everything we can to make sure that their names are out there, because the owners listen to the media.
Yeah, well, and that's a great point. Back in the 50s and 60s, I guess, part of the civil rights movement, the old motto that some of the black press came up with was don't shop where you can't work. And so that's why I raised the question, why should you play where people only value you for touchdowns and making tackles, as opposed to also for your intellect and your ability to be a leader in terms of growing up to be a coach. Jeremi, I mean, you see this from another level because you're not in the coaching, but you're advising the Fritz Pollard Alliance. What do you tell them at this particular time? I mean, how can we get beyond making lists, turning them in, asking people to exercise their goodwill and be fair in the hiring process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think that, as we've pointed out, if we're going to, I think in any civil rights movement of any sort, if you're relying on goodwill, then you're in trouble. If that's all you're relying on, then you're in trouble, because what we found is that when there's a power structure, the goodwill isn't always there. And so for me, I think one of the key things at this juncture is to work not on goodwill as much as on interest convergence. That is to say, let these owners, or in the case of the college athletics, these universities, understand that they are helping themselves by thinking broadly about who they're going to hire, by casting a wide net, by being deliberate about diversity. I mean, there are all sorts of studies we could sit here and talk about for some time about the extent to which a diverse decision-making body produces a better result. And so, we have the days of us just essentially saying, hey, listen, be fair to these individuals. I don't know if we can rely on that anymore. Rather, it's like, look, you should, as us lawyers, you make alternative arguments. One, you need to be fair and equitable. In the event that you're not, we go to argument 2, which is this also benefits you. So by being fair and equitable and thinking broadly and going to a diverse pool and inviting diversity into your organization, you will be better. Your bottom line will be better. You will win more, and ultimately in the professional ranks, you will make more money. So I think we need to focus now on interest convergence, making sure those in power recognize that doing the right thing also helps them.
Yeah, I think about this, and I think about the fact that right here in Washington D.C., where the Washington football team held on as the last segregated team in the NFL, it only changed at the threat of bayonet from the federal government, which was going to refuse it to play in a stadium that was built with federal funds. And then you look at the Washington football team again and what's happened this summer in terms of, after 87 years, dropping a name that was had long been defined as a racial slur, only after pressure was brought upon them by the sponsors of their team and the sponsors of the league. And so it seems like, more pressure needs to be brought about here. And Mike, let me get back to you. I'm just wondering, as a career coach and all your friends who are in this and have aspired to be head coaches at either the NFL or in college, how discouraging is it to know that you're still fighting the same battle, 10 years later, 20 years later, 25 years later?
Yeah, it can be extremely discouraging. But one of the things as coaches that we're always taught is we're going to keep battling until all the time is off the clock. And for me, that's where, the give a crap gauge is winding down, as I feel like I'm on the back 9 of my career. And it's time for me, again, instead of just talking about the issue, to try to be part of the solution. And again, I can't say enough. And to echo what Jeremy said, part of being able to attract a guy like Nick Saban was me telling and talking to him about the benefits of him and his legacy of being a part of the coalition and helping push the needle forward. And when I explained to him what he did for my career in terms of rebranding me, and I was very deliberate in every move I made. When I left and went to Alabama, I started as an off the field analyst. I became a co-coordinator, and I just kept showing within the structure of that organization what my capabilities were. And the next thing you know, I've got the keys to the Ferrari. And because of that, and because of him, and it wasn't goodwill, I think it's like what we talked about. He saw, one, the ability I had to manage players, but also bring in really good players to help his legacy. And I told him point blank, I said, Coach, for your legacy, the fact that you get involved with this coalition and you champion other guys like me, look at what you did for me. Imagine what you can do for a bunch of other young Mike Locksleys coming up through the ranks. So it's definitely discouraging when you look and you see that same issues that we've had when I got in it 30 years ago haven't changed. But as coaches, we're taught to keep fighting the fight until there's no time left on the clock. And as discouraged as we are, I feel like if we can use the things that are happening in society today and it always takes more than just minorities to move the needle. And the counterparts of all the different people I've enlisted to help with this coalition, we're hoping that we're able to make some sustainable change and get some fair, equitable opportunities, because we just want the opportunity. We're not trying to force you to do anything, but we want the opportunity to show you we can do it.
And let me turn it over to Lila, because I know you wrote that fine article that we shared with the audience. And I'm sure, like any journalist, when you write a piece and you've done a lot of interviews, there's always like one question that maybe you didn't get in. So let me give you an opportunity to fire away your question.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I didn't touch on in the article, but I found out a lot about specifically through the Global Sport Institute, is how for coaches of color, there's a much higher playing level required in experience, whereas for white coaches, there isn't as much experience needed, and oftentimes they're way more likely to get a job even if they haven't played the game. So for each of you, I was just wondering how big of a factor you think that plays in the lack of minority head coaches in the league.
Well, maybe I'll start with that, Lila. I think that's a fascinating insight, and it's absolutely true. But one of the more interesting things is to look at it across sports and how race plays out differently. So in sports where the players are predominantly white, you see all these, being a player as a former player as a criteria becomes very prominent, like in hockey. But in sports where the African Americans or other minorities are predominant, then you see a differential about, hey, wait a minute, we don't need to have former players to be head coaches. And then you see a lot of white coaches that aren't former players. So it's a really good analysis. I'm glad you had that observation. I think that's, it's totally on point.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Mike or Jeremy?
No, I echo what Cyrus said. I think that's exactly right. Those are the dynamics that are at play. And once again, when you have a situation in which African Americans would benefit from a particular norm, the norm tends not to follow. In a situation where African Americans be disadvantaged by it, the norm often does. It's just a part of the systemic racism that envelopes us in this country right now.
Something else that should be pointed out here, Cyrus I was thinking about when Cyrus mentioned Tyrone Willingham, but minority coaches, when they do get jobs, they often don't get the best job, and whatever job they wind up getting, they tend to have less time to prove themselves on that job,
right,
than their white counterparts. So there are a whole lot of problems to this situation.
Yes.
This totally is, Kevin. Hey, one thing I wanted to follow up on a little bit, you mentioned the Washington Football Club, a ray of hope a little bit, but also underscores the point you just made, is for the first time there's an African-American president of an NFL club this last few months when Jason Wright took over as president. But he also took over a team that's the most dysfunctional team in the league right now at a time of incredible series of crises going on at that team. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that ray of hope, but also picking up a little bit of what Jeremy said, focusing on the decision-making side. So we really have pushed hard, being the Fritz Pollard Alliance, to fight for using the Rooney Rule or other tools to diversify across the board positions in the league and the clubs. And we're starting to make some headway there. We're also trying to push for women getting opportunities. And now you'll see a few clubs have the first female coaches on the field. A couple of years ago, there's a first woman game day official. So some of these kind of all male, all exclusionary roles are now starting to erode a little bit. But so it takes a across the board effort. I'd like to see colleges adopt the Rooney Rule for athletic director, head coach, and even presidents. Why shouldn't the board of trustees interview a university or college president candidates that are diverse? Seems like that's a minimal requirement that they should do right now.
And it seems like something that if you are a public school, if you're a flagship university of a state, there's a state budget. There are all sorts of rules and regulations you have to answer to. It seems to me that there can be pressure brought to bear upon those institutions to do the right thing as state government. And I wonder sometimes why no one has attempted to use that leverage when it comes to these sorts of hiring practices. And then, of course, on top of all of this, you have the economic truth. Here, the University of Maryland is no different than any of the other Power 5 conferences where I'm sure the majority of Mike's athletes are predominantly Black, and they are generating all of this wealth which college football generates. And when you look at the NFL, the numbers are up to 70% Black players, generating all the wealth in the NFL. Of course, they get to share in it. But then the question is, how much of the decision making do they get to share in? Will Patrick Mahomes, for example, now with a $500 million contract and part owner of the Kansas City franchise, will he have some say at the table, not only with Kansas City when it comes to hiring, but throughout the league? I mean, is that fantasy to think that he should be able to do that?
Jeremy, do you want to talk about the first point about what's happened on the state level?
You mean with respect to the Rooney Rule?
Yeah, I mean, Kevin was asking about what states could do. Maybe you could talk about Oregon a little bit.
Yeah. In a move, I guess, not exactly where you were, Kevin, but analogous. Oregon actually has used its strength as a state, as a state government, through the legislature to require that any university, any of its 7 public universities, looking for a head coach in any sport or an athletic director, that they must interview a person of color. And that state legislature was passed overwhelmingly. And it's interesting, when it was passed, there were bills being brought to the fore in any number of states around the country. I counted a dozen at one point, including Alabama, Tennessee, and a few others. And those efforts ended up falling short. But that's one example of a state taking it upon itself to get involved in, in leveling the playing field in collegiate athletics.
And what about doing that at the NFL level as well, when you have owners who are profiting in part off of being able to play in stadiums that were built for them, off the public gold? Can that not be a part of negotiations, a part of those contracts? I mean, might that carry more bite than even the Rooney Rule?
Yeah, no, I think it can potentially carry a lot of bite, Kevin. The issue that I've seen, and Cyrus, you may chime in on what you've seen in the law, is that generally speaking, notwithstanding the fact that that some of these stadiums are publicly financed and some are public-private partnerships, that has not been deemed to turn what the club does into state action that would then trigger the Constitution and any other number of protections that exist with respect to being discriminated against, let's say, by a state actor. And so I think as a rhetorical tool and an atmospheric tool, I think pointing to the publicness of these clubs is valuable. As a legal tool, I don't think we're there yet where it would give basis for a claim. Okay.
And at this point, let me open it up to some questions from our audience. And I think Caitlin Wilson can cue some of those up.
Yes. Our first question comes from Wade. 2 NFL teams have already fired their coaches and more will inevitably come. Does the coalition have any particular strategies to get minority coaches into meeting rooms for these open positions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And right now, the coalition is working behind the scenes with our board of directors, which consists of some, as I said, very powerful leaders and former leaders of some of these organizations, where we're putting together some charge letters and things to send out to the organizations that have openings, to start the dialogue, to start the conversation, as we have in some other situations that have happened here at the college level as well. So we are working behind the scenes to create a charge through our board of directors to come up with a game plan for how we want to help facilitate getting us in front of the people that are making these types of decisions.
Caitlin, maybe I can just weigh in a little bit from the Fritz Pollard Alliance. Since 2003 or 4, we've been giving the NFL what we call a ready list of viable, strong candidates, like Coach was talking about, for every kind of position. head coach, coordinator, player personnel, GM, just go on down the list, so that no one can ever doubt we don't have a very strong set of candidates, pipeline, what have you. Every time there's an opening, right now, Rod Graves, who leads the FPA, and prior to that, John Wooten, who chaired the Fritz Pollard Alliance, is in outreach to the decision makers. And what are you looking for? What's your timeline, so we can make sure they have as much information as they need to make a decision, and to make sure that process is inclusive and has a wealth of diverse candidates on the slate of candidates. So that's our normal methodology, and we're still doing that.
Our next question comes from Merrill College student Reese, and it's for Coach Locksley. By having 20 people of color, including yourself, on your coaching, strength, and front office staff, what kind of message do you hope to send to other schools and other pro teams by having such a diverse staff in prominent roles?
Yeah, one, I think it starts that anytime we recruit and we bring prospective student athletes to our campus, we show that there are viable candidates, and each and every one of the people I've hired are qualified and were qualified to do the job. And I didn't go out and seek to bring in 20. I just basically interviewed and talked to people that I've known over the years, people that I've admired, the work they've done. I did the homework and the research on each and every one of these candidates. And just so happens that I guess, and I never knew the number till they said it, 20 of them happen to be minority candidates. So it wasn't something going in that I was intentional about, but it's also it's not something that I'm apologize for, because I feel very confident in each and every one of the 20 that they're capable of doing the job. And I want to do all I can to help them ascend to whatever levels they want to in their respective fields.
Great. Our next question comes from Michael, and it's for the group. Do you think that the lack of diversity within the NFL coaching ranks is a reflection of what's going on in Washington right now?
I'd like to address that a little bit. I definitely feel that there was a lot of headwind against us the last few years. And I feel that there was a moment when the ownership kind of buckled under pressure from the White House and a variety of political things. That was a sad moment for the league. Now I feel that some of the things we've been advocating for, like pushing voting as a key part of citizenship and leading by example. You'll see NFL votes. That's something FPA and others have been trying to advocate for. That's a really positive dynamic. We have a person in the White House who flirts with white nationalism, who actually put out directives that says anti-racism efforts is anti-American. So I do think that kind of poisons the atmosphere, makes things more divisive, but also I think we're at a great moment of opportunity, because it makes people more aware that we can't just be lackluster and go through the motions. If we're going to have America live up to its great ideals, we have to be intentional about it. We want to have equal opportunity. We have to be intentional about it. So for me, I overall feel a moment of excitement, because I feel there's a lot more possibilities. We can talk about systemic racism openly today much more easily than even a year ago.
Okay. Ivan asks, how viable is the model of players speaking out at the college level, and will ADs and presidents listen to them?
Yeah, that's a unique question, Ivan, and I actually lived it. In 2015, when I served as the interim head coach here at Maryland, there was a quarterback that was coming out of this area that had committed to play football by the name of Dwayne Haskins. And I can remember when the job opened and I was one of the finalists for the job in 2015, Dwayne's dad and his family were really strongly suggesting to the powers that be here at Maryland that if they wanted to keep his commitment, they should strongly consider hiring me. Now, I was dead set against it in terms of I didn't want the job because of that. I wanted the job because they thought I could do the job. And I can tell you just from going through that experience, it went on deaf ears. And I still, again, I think there is some strength in the platform that some of these great athletes have. But I still think, if you look at the NFL, goodwill runs out. It's important right now because of some of the social injustices that have happened. But at some point, the goodwill part runs out. And the only way you usually affect owners of NFL franchises or even athletic directors and the boosters involved with them is you affect their pocketbooks. You affect their ability to make money. So I do think there's been more and more of a consciousness by the minority recruits coming up. You look at the top basketball player who committed to go play at Howard University and what a powerful message it sent. But I just don't know that it has that much of a stroke in making that decision in terms of hiring.
Okay, and looks like we have about time for one more question. So the final question here, what can fans do to promote diversity in coaching positions?
Jeremy, do you want to take one? You haven't spoken in a little bit.
Sure. If fans are willing to, you talk with your feet. You can. Ultimately, I think Coach Locksley just made the point that's been made earlier. Kevin made it with respect to the Washington football team changing its name because of the pressure from sponsors. Ultimately, fans are a huge part of this equation. And if fans aren't interested in supporting a team en masse, that team will do what the fans want. Now, the question is how to organize people in a way where you can have that sort of effect. But if the entire fan base, for example, of the Washington football team said, we're not going to any more games until the name is changed, then it wouldn't have taken FedEx saying anything. The fans could have made could have forced a change. And I think fans can also force a change in this regard. But the question is what sort of organization would have to take place for that to be a viable path.
Standing. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This was interesting. I think beyond interesting, just thought-provoking and some good nuggets of information there about this issue that I think a lot of people were not necessarily aware of. And I thank our audience for asking those questions. I want to kick it back right now to Mark Hyman. After I once again say thank you all for joining us, and let him put a nice bow on this event. Mark?
Well, let me echo Kevin's words about the panel. I thought it was thoughtful and just a great panel, exactly what we expected. I believe that Coach Locksley is a busy man. I believe you have a football game on Saturday, Coach.
Finally.
Okay, so we want
Long awaited.
we want to wish you luck out at Northwestern.
Thank you.
And before we break, I just wanted to invite everyone to the 15th annual Povich Center Symposium, which will be November 17th at 7 p.m. And our topic will be diversity in the owner's box, how sports will be different when women and people of color are represented equitably. I really hope you can join us for that. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Kevin. Hope to see you in November.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Thank
you
you all
guys.
very much.